My name is Lynn Lyons, and I'm the Promotions and Publicity Coordinator at the University of Manitoba Press. And I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us tonight for the launch of Plundering the North, a history of settler colonialism, corporate welfare, and food insecurity. Tonight we'll be joined by the authors of the book, Travis Hay and Kristin Burnett, and our host for tonight, Dr. Lana Ray. And before we begin, we think it's important for us, even though we are all coming together virtually from many different places, to acknowledge the geographic area that has come to be known as Canada and the United States. Currently resides on lands and territories stolen from Indigenous nations. We also recognize that the violent practices and structures of settler colonialism are ongoing and continue to seek to erase pre-existing cultural, political, and economic systems and networks of Indigenous peoples. We also extend our respect to the elders, both past and present, and to all the Anishinaabe Indigenous peoples who are the traditional custodians of Turtle Island. Specifically, we want to acknowledge the territories upon which the press and the universities our hosts and authors come from reside. The University of Manitoba Press is located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. Mount Royal University is located on the traditional territories of the Nitsitapi, Blackfoot, and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Pekingese, the Kanas, the Tsuut'ina, and the Ayahe Nakota. The city of Calgary is home to districts 5 and 6 of the Métis Nation of Alberta. Lakehead University in Thunder Bay is built on the territories of the Fort William First Nation. Lakehead Aurelia is located on the territories of the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe includes the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. Finally, it is important to remind ourselves that our standard of living is directly related to the resources taken from the Indigenous peoples in the past and present through ongoing settler colonialism and genocide. The authors and press reaffirm the commitments to working with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples to build relationships rooted in the principles of mutual trust, respect, and reciprocity, and collaboration. It is our responsibility to work towards reconciliation and unsettling. It is also Indigenous Veterans Day, and we wanted to acknowledge those who have served as they face challenges after their post-service life. Many Indigenous war veterans would not receive equal treatment compared to other Canadian veterans. And I'd also like to share a 30% off code in the chat. You can see it on the PDF there. But if you buy the book directly from the U of M Press website, if you'd like, you can get 30% off. If you'd like to purchase the book but don't want to do it through our website, we urge you to support independent bookstores. McNally Robinson in Winnipeg and Saskatoon are a great example. They do a lot for local writers, and they do ship across Canada. So again, the discount code is NORTH30 for 30% off. And now I'd like to introduce you to tonight's host, Dr. Lana Ray. She is an associate professor at the School of Nursing, Indigenous Research Chair in Decolonial Futures, and the director of Anishinaabe Kendasuin Institute at Lakehead University. Previously, she worked in the public and not-for-profit sectors, including as the director of policy and research at the Provincial Indigenous Organization. Welcome, Lana.
Miigwech. Bonjour, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here today with Drs. Hayes and Dr. Burnett. I have my warm cup of tea, and I'm hoping for the next hour we'll have more so a conversation where we sit and have tea and talk about this wonderful book, which I think, you know, has interest both to those who are historians, academics, but also when we're thinking about our responsibilities in regards to settlers and treaty responsibilities and those who are on these lands. We just had our traditional land acknowledgement, that it really provides a really amazing context for understanding how food insecurity was manufactured and to have that education as a basis to move forward in action to address a lot of these acts of violence and things like food insecurity that we see as a result of settler colonialism. So to me, this book is definitely a must read for people, particularly if you are living or occupying lands in this territory. And I know we only have an hour, and there's so much depth in this book. So I'm just going to get right into it. I'm going to introduce our authors, and then we're going to start talking more about the book in detail. So again, my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kristin Burnett, who is, and both are our former, still current colleagues of mine, which I'm proud to say. So Dr. Burnett is a professor in the Department of Indigenous Learning at Lakehead University. She's a settler scholar. Kristin's published broadly on topics related to Indigenous health and well-being, and much of her current research and policy work engages with systematic barriers to healthcare, social services, supports, and food. And we're also joined by Dr. Travis Hay, who's a historian of Canadian settler colonialism, born and raised in Thunder Bay, Ontario. He is currently an assistant professor at Mount Royal University, was also with us at Lakehead University for a number of years, and is the author of Inventing the Thrifty Gene and the English language book review editor of Canadian Journal of Health History. So Chimi Gwich to you both for this book that you've written and for joining us here today.
Thanks, Lana. Thanks for hosting.
Thanks, Lana. I appreciate it. I appreciate you.
So maybe just to start, I'm wondering if I could start with you, Kristin. If you could just kind of, like I said, there's a lot that you've packed into this book. If you could just take me through a bit of an overview of the book. So kind of what is it about, and really why this book now? So why did you and Travis decide to write this book?
So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. To be honest, I came from Southern Alberta, and I took up my first kind of grown-up job at Lakehead University in the winter of 2007. And shortly thereafter, I was really lucky to work with a student who had grown up in a remote community. And she was doing her undergraduate honors degree at Lakehead, and she wanted to do an undergraduate thesis that looked at kind of the role of diabetes in our community and perceptions. And she also wanted to look at kind of what were the barriers that people faced in terms of accessing enough food and good food, right? Or what was identified as good food. And so in order to do that, we looked at the Northern Store, what was available at the Northern Store, and then did a comparison with Thunder Bay. And for me, that was the first time that I'd ever come across the Northern Store. I'd never heard of the Northern Store. I had no idea of what the Northern Store was. And then that kind of spiraled from there, right? And so, looking at the Northwest Company, then looking at the Hudson's Bay Company, how did they get involved with food? And so this kind of pattern of this historical pattern of the ways in which the kind of corporations worked hand in glove with the settler state around food and access to food in northern communities in this period. And what we saw emerge were kind of three patterns, right? And the three patterns really were the denigration of Indigenous foodways and food economies, and the efforts to replace them with European Canadian market-based foods, right? In order to what they believed would achieve healthy outcomes through the reinvention of Indigenous peoples and communities as more right? And then second, the carrying out of roles normally undertaken by the state, by the Hudson's Bay Company and later by the Northwest Company. So, the distribution of treaty annuities, the distribution of healthcare, credit, postal services, all of these things are a pattern that, started with the Hudson's Bay Company and is still being undertaken by the Northwest Company or the Northern Store. And then finally, what we see in this pattern of over 100 years is that there's an imposition of programs by the state and its proxies, i.e. corporations and communities like the Northern Store, that are never going to work, right? And in the kind of setting up of these programs that are ultimately going to end in failure, Indigenous bodies and people are always blamed as the reasons why they fail, right? And these are constant themes, particularly in food insecurity, right? That we see across 100 years that are really important to kind of tease out and talk about. And we do this through looking at what does the Hudson's Bay look like after the Second World War? What are the sorts of, food subsidy programs that get imposed that start to predetermine the kinds of choices Indigenous people can make about market-based foods? And then, so the family allowance program, the food mail program, the Nutrition North program, and how does the Northwest Company then get produced after 1987 when it gets sold to executives in the Hudson's Bay Company and external investors. So it's a really important history, I think, to tease out, to see those patterns of continuity and kind of governmentality, if you will.
Language. Yeah, and I think some of those points we're going to circle back around on. I have some questions and some areas that I was reading. I had wanted, to explore further, so I'll bring those up. But especially doing this work in an Indigenous context, it's so important to understand people's positionality and how they come to the work. So I'm wondering for yourself, Travis, what was your introduction to really understanding food insecurity in the North, and your motivations for working on this book project?
Yeah, well, as someone who was born and raised in Thunder Bay, which is really a service hub city that services many of those northern communities, I went to Sir Winston Churchill High School, which was right beside DFC High School in Thunder Bay, the high school where many kids from northern communities had to go because they don't have high schools in their communities. And so this context in Thunder Bay, I went to high school during the same time as many of the Seven Fallen Feathers that Tanya Talega's written about in her book. And so the lack of service equity in the North is something that is part of the context, I think, of Thunder Bay. And I've been lucky enough to learn from and work with a lot of Anishinaabe elders. I did some work on the history of diabetes and the ideologies that go towards constructing Aboriginal diabetes in the North. And through the course of that work, I was able to work with the Anishinaabe elder Terry Red Sky Fiddler from Sandy Lake First Nation. Marlene Peer from Fort William First Nation is also someone who's been really generous in their time with me. And really the book and working with Kristin allowed me the opportunity to really try and put into action a conviction to try and be a good treaty partner, not only in Robinson Superior territory, but I think if you live in Thunder Bay, and especially anywhere between, Thunder Bay and Winnipeg, treaties 3, 5, and 9 are also, I really think, to be considered full treaty partners. And I should be clear that when I started on this project, I was a master's student. I took my undergrad in history from Kristin, and the opportunity to work with her on this project was really one way I was able to really try and create actionable ways that would help academic research do something that might at least matter a little bit to northern communities, which is a pathway I was really happy to be able to start on. And this book, which was a long time coming, was really a really big learning process also for me, just about the material conditions in the North. And I think many Canadians are vaguely aware about things like boil water advisories, do not consume orders, and the high cost of food. But the egregious expenses at the grocery store, especially when you see on social media or Canadian news media, the price of the food, it's so egregious that it really begs a question, like, how does this happen? And I think that the book was a good opportunity to answer that. And unfortunately, the answer is rather unsettling. It's not shipping fees, to put it shortly.
Yeah, I think one of the contributions that your book makes, or one of the popular narratives that it challenges, is kind of this idea of that's the cost of doing business up north, right? It's just expensive, and really normalizing particular ways of food access, food prices, all of these sorts of things. So I'm wondering at this point, I know, Travis, there was a segment from the book that you had wanted to share, and I think it directly relates to this conversation that we're having now. So I'm wondering if you want to do that reading at this point, and then we could pick up on some of the notes from this conversation in a bit more of a nuanced way.
Yeah, you bet. And I'll be quick with it, folks. Don't worry. I won't bore everyone to tears reading from the book. But I wanted to read a quick passage to kind of just give a good preview of what's in it. And this passage comes at a time when we're kind of in the year 1987. And this is when the kind of northern store as we know it today, in terms of its business structure, is really starting to take off and really focus on food sales in northern communities. And the passage describes how they were able to expand from food sales to fast food, to postal services, financial services, medical services. And the creation of this monopoly is not one that's limited to grocery sales, although that is our entry point in the conversation. I'll start reading here. In 1991, 4 years after acquisition, food sales represented 58.4% of the Northwestern Company's total revenue, which was an 8.1 increase from the previous year. The board of directors described the success of the new business model in the following terms, quote, "Our recent performance is evidence that our business is less cyclical than other retailers, and that our niche strategy of concentrating on small northern communities is working," end quote. The annual reports of the Northwest Company frequently noted that, quote, "nearly 3/4 of our customers are of Aboriginal origin, and that our customers are more dependent than most Canadians on government spending programs," end quote. While Indigenous peoples living in the provincial and far north, especially on reserve, may have faced disproportionate rates of poverty and unemployment and limited disposable income to purchase luxury items, the sale of food is not restricted by these factors. People have to eat. Discussions about the socioeconomic and legal status of Indigenous peoples in Northern Canada were included in all of the Northwest Company annual reports after 1990 as a matter of formula, illustrating an awareness and intentionality on part of the board of directors that the company's profits were largely dependent on the colonial power relationships that make up material conditions in the provincial and far norths. Indeed, this predatory practice of targeting colonized communities was made crystal clear when long-term Northwest Company president and CEO Edward Kennedy noted in his annual message to shareholders, and I quote, "We benefited from spending tied to resource development projects in the North, higher oil-generated permanent fund dividends, and the payment of Indian residential school survivor settlements in Canada," end quote. The Northwest Company also began at this time to heavily invest in introducing fast food outlets to northern communities in 1992. Between 1992 and 1996, more than 50 Kentucky Fried Chicken stores in Northwest Company-owned retail outlets were opened. 2 Pizza Hut outlets were built in 1993, and that year's annual report described them as very successful. In 1994, the Northwest Company added 17 KFCs, 19 Pizza Huts, and 1 A&W and Burger King to their Quick Stop brand. The Northwest Company strategy of cornering financial services in the North was also remarkably successful, targeting particularly vulnerable people who do not have many options. It should be noted here that Fly-in First Nations do not have financial institutions on reserve, and therefore community members have little to no choice regarding where and how they can carry out financial transactions. From 1990 to 1995, the Northwest Company slowly but surely grew its capacity and market share of northern food sales. And they increasingly used the capital generated from these and other business operations to expand into other northern markets, both in Canada and Alaska, as well as other forms of service provision such as medical, financial, and postal. Throughout this period, the company intentionally monitored the socioeconomic and legal factors that informed material conditions for Indigenous communities to ensure profitability. Significantly, at least based on their annual reports, store managers continued to exercise extraordinary power over their customer base. And we quote from an annual report. "Northern stores often operate in communities without banking facilities, and managers must make sensitive credit granting decisions about customers who may well be their neighbor," end quote. The Northwest Company in general and the Northern chain in particular specialized in administering poverty in Indigenous communities and regulating food purchases in a manner that increased profits for the company and made individuals and families beholden to the Northwest Company, continuing many of the same practices begun by the Hudson's Bay Company, where factorers and post managers made decisions about credit based on their perception of the individual's character. In these decades, the Northwest Company both maintained and acquired new power in these communities, as often the sole providers of not only commercial food, but of medicine, financial credit, and access to the outside world. Thank you.
Miigwech for that reading, Travis.
Sorry, Lana, can I interrupt just one? I just want to add one thing. And part of it is I just want to show the continuity with earlier Hudson's Bay Company practices, right? And so I've got, sorry, I know we've read at you and I apologize for that, but I think there's a couple really illustrated quotations that show the continuity of the relationship between the state and the Hudson's Bay Company prior to 1987. And so there's two, I think, really illustrative ones. And one takes place just after the Second World War, when the Indian Affairs is wanting to introduce fortified flour to Indigenous communities in Northern Ontario, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. With the Hudson's Bay Company, it's its primary distributor. And Indian Affairs even offers to subsidize the additional costs related to the sale of fortified flour until it becomes popular among community members. And although this legislation never gets passed, the Indian Affairs actually offers or suggests that in order to ensure uptake of this fortified flour, Indian Affairs could propose legislation that forbids the sale of other kinds of flour. And so if you start to look at it in those contexts, this sort of absolute control over what the market looks like and what gets sold in communities is something that gets set much, much earlier and then carried through, right? So what the Northern Store does is a pattern that's set decades and decades earlier by the Hudson's Bay Company in hand with the Indian Affairs. And even in testimony before the Senate House of Commons Committee in 1947, Mr. Gifford Swartman, the Indian agent at Sioux Lookout, described the role played by the Family Allowance Program in shaping the retail landscape of the North and the food choices available to Indigenous peoples. And I'm quoting directly from what he submitted to the House of Commons Senate Committee. Had it not been for family allowances, I know the merchants and traders in the remote areas would not have stocked the essential items such as tomatoes, milk in large quantities, pablum, cheese, fruits, vegetables. Ask any trader or post manager in the Inland Post how much milk he sold prior to family allowances, and his answer would amaze you. As some posts over a 10-year period, records show from 1 to 2 drums of powdered milk and no canned milk sold each year. This year, the same traders will sell from 1.5 to 2 tons of powdered milk and canned milk. And so the enormous relationship that we can see between Indian Affairs and what gets sold and purchased at the Hudson's Bay Company and later the Northern Store is wild, really, right? Like, it's wild.
Yeah, and I think the point you made there and in Travis's reading as well is also very well demonstrated throughout the book as well, right? That idea that Indigenous food systems, ways of living off the land are irrelevant, can't be successful, and these are now this capitalist economy, this corporate model is the inevitable system, right? That will prevail. And you list a number of examples, the ones you've talked about throughout the book of really creating the government manufacturing the conditions for the success of the Hudson Bay Company, and then subsequently, right, the Hudson's Bay Company forwarding the goals of the colonial government as well. I'm just wondering if there's any other comments or pieces that you want to pick up on in regards to that.
I'll jump in quickly, because so much of what we do in the book, I think, is really critiquing where this fuzzy line is between the kind of neoliberal market ideologies of privatize everything in Canada and the very specific settler colonial conditions to which northern communities are subject. And I think within that conversation, what gets missed here is like the real power and potential of Indigenous entrepreneurship. And although I think we should be critical of using market-based solutions anytime we approach this subject, I mean, I'll even give a quick plug here for a book that's coming out, University of Manitoba Press, March of 2024, a book called Engraved on Our Nation's Indigenous Economic Tenacity. And I think so much of why I mention this is because if you look even quickly at the kind of the tenacity and the innovation of Indigenous entrepreneurs in Canada, it's very considerable. And if we look at the system that is set up in the North currently, even if someone wanted to compete with the Northern Store, the extent to which they own shipping routes, shipping companies, equipment rentals, all of this, it forecloses entrepreneurship in a very fundamental way, I think. And I think what we're seeing here is not necessarily the classical operation of capitalism, because what we're seeing here is a very non-invisible hand that is the settler colonial policies in Canada that enter into and shape these markets. And I don't think what we're dealing with here is an organic market-based system, but a real fundamentally colonial one. And this is something that not only prevents food security and sovereignty, but it forecloses the success of Indigenous entrepreneurs. And that money is going to the Northwest Company through many of their various outlets here.
And I'm wondering, just to pick up on that point, and maybe Kristin, you could start off by answering this one. You had mentioned it, Travis, too, throughout the book, there's kind of this narrative of talking about that interrelationship, or kind of where is the line between corporations and government. And one thing that I've learned and seen in the work that both you do as historians is your ability to connect the historical work that you do and to always think about it in the current context and how you can make history actionable. So I think there's definitely through your book a commentary about perhaps a cautionary tale and really thinking about this idea of corporate social responsibility and how that's constructed. And what is, and if there is a role for that in terms of thinking about some of these issues that are a result of settler colonialism. Particularly, we see a lot of these conversations happening today around resource development as well, and in regards to partnerships and other fields as well. So maybe, like I said, if I could start with you, Kristin. So are there some lessons that could be learned, or information that can be transferred that you think are useful from this book in that larger conversation about corporate social responsibility?
Oh, that's a really, really hard question. I mean, my perspective is generally that social corporate responsibility is really a way of kind of red washing this sort of damage that a lot of corporations do in Indigenous and to Indigenous communities, right? I'm actually teaching a class right now on climate change, and this week we looked at mining companies and oil companies in the petroleum industry in Alberta, right? And there's a lot of social responsibility and discourse around the introduction of EDI practices, and ultimately these sorts of things are mirrors, are distractions, right? So if you look at the Northern Store, the Northwest Company has a fund that people can apply to. It sponsors diabetes initiatives in communities. It sponsors a diabetes walk, I think, in Hawaii, that takes place in Hawaii every other year, right? And so there's a lot of corporate giving, right, which is also corporate tax breaks when you think about it, that I think masks the sort of real money that gets taken from Indigenous communities. Because if you think about it, the money that is made in this community doesn't stay in this community, right? It does not benefit members of the community. It's taken far out of the community. And I think those are the things that we need to kind of start to realize, that I think local ownership, Indigenous sovereignty has to be Indigenous sovereignty. And that means that these kinds of corporations can't exist in communities. And that, yes, sorry.
Travis, I'm wondering if there's something that you want to add to this conversation.
Yeah, I don't want to come across as too cynical, right? But I think when corporations try and give back to communities, like just on the face of it, I'm just in my own personal politics. I'm not someone who is immediately very impressed. And one of the things that I'm glad that this book does is when the Northwest Company speaks about its own business operations, not only do they suggest what they're doing is fundamentally risky, it is not. And their annual reports say as much. When they're trying to get money from shareholders and to sell stocks, the business operations are much more reliable than when you criticize their business practices. And then they start to talk with what I think is a bit of an attitude. They start to act like what they're doing in these communities is risky and it's a favor to these northern communities. And the patronizing tone that they have when they describe their business operation is something that I think insults the integrity of all Canadians. In a literate academic world, if you want to maintain that what you're doing to these communities is not exploitative, but to the contrary, something that is a risk for you in helping them, then you should have a lot better of a business record than the Northwest Company does have. And it is not a very egregious argument to underscore that these are the things that are foreclosing food security and sovereignty in the North, far from helping anything like rates of diabetes in the North, supporting co-ops, which they could do. There's a wonderful documentary that many people should watch. It's the first Indigenous-led documentary made by the Other Side of the Ledger is the name of it. And in this ledger, we have Howard Adams really lambasting the Hudson's Bay Company, underscoring, one, the privatization should be something that is resisted and that communities should have that control themselves. But two, he underscores how much money and power these corporations have, and they don't do anything for those communities, not in the real sense. Kristin and Lana, you'll both know how often Indigenous students you have at Lakehead go broke because they're paying to fly home for funerals in the North. And the ways in which those costs and just living in the North, especially if you have to transit between for school, education, employment, this is such an egregious and daily insult that's so expensive. Sorry, I'm getting a little cranky here, but the degree to which the Northwest Company represents itself as doing a favor, I think is an insult to those communities and can't be said to a group of people who have a solid understanding of their history as well as the contemporary realities that they uphold in those communities.
Well, and I think if we want to kind of look at some more concrete examples, there's a really great study done by Nicholas Lee and Tracy Galloway that recently was published that looked at how much of the kind of current Nutrition North subsidy was actually passed on to customers at the point of purchase, which they're required to show. And they found that over a 3-year period in monopoly communities, at least 33, in some cases, 33 cents of every dollar, subsidy dollar, was not being passed on to customers. So almost a third of that money that's supposed to go to reduce the cost of food is not being passed on. And so when we think about the amount of money that gets made by corporations off the backs of Indigenous folks in these communities, it's wild. But then that they also then claim, as Travis and both Lana have said, that it's the cost of doing business, that this is what it is. And I've worked with people who run alternative markets in their community, and basically they sell food for cost, right? They have perfected the system of like transporting by plane, train, automobile, right? Like all of these things into their community, and they sell the food to their community members at cost. All they want to do is make back the money and ensure that people have enough food, and have access to fresh foods, right? Which is huge. And so, and it's interesting because in that community, when they have the food sales at the market, there's actually sales at the northern store when there never usually are, right? So competition actually did change that. But in order for this to happen, it's essentially in this alternative market, it's two individuals who put stuff on their credit cards and then hopefully make back that money. And that's not a sustainable situation, but it shows how incredible and powerful Indigenous sovereignties can be when they're enacted and care and social responsibility and community is played out.
And just like in the book where you end on more of a note of optimism and you talk about Indigenous-led futurities around food sovereignty, I wanted to close in the same way. So I'll circle back around to that point a little bit later on. But I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more too about this idea of accountability, because I think it's not blatant, but there's an undertone throughout the book of a call for accountability in regards to the way that food security programming is currently operating. So you speak to, right, the Auditor General's report, not having the profits from the Northwest Company released. You speak to some other things as well. You even speak about accountability in relation to research and structures and transparency about how research was conducted that supports particular modes or paths forward for food security. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about accountability in relation to food security in the North. And what are some steps that you both think need to happen?
Go ahead, Kristin, please.
Oh no, that's a really, really hard question. And part of it is because I don't think I'm kind of qualified to ask that question, right? And I think that's a question that needs to be answered by community, and not a settler that doesn't live in those communities. And I think part of it, what we've shown, you know, in terms of looking at the Food Mail program, in terms of looking at the Nutrition North program, whenever these programs were introduced, right, there is some performative consultation with Indigenous communities, right? And so, for example, when Food Mail changed, or it was going to change, it would hold select community conversations in various communities and by and large ignore that advice, right? I mean, the Food Mail program held a series of consultations in which they basically asked people to choose what they were willing to give up in order to keep the bare minimum of the subsidy, right? That's not that's, how can you ask people? It's like, can you choose between having food for your kid and whether or not you can buy, you know, cleaning solution, or you're going to be able to buy, you know, dental hygiene products, right? Or gas, right? Like, or water. And so these consultations are very much set up in a way in which the answers are already decided. And the goal of the state is already going to be achieved. So, you know, initially the Food Mail program, they were going to get rid of it and they were going to increase it by at least 30 cents. You know, communities protested, you know, there was huge wholesale protests. They introduced it anyway after all the consultation, and, you know, they only reduced they only increased the subsidy, increased the amount of, you know, it would cost to ship things into communities by 25 cents, right? Like, oh my God, 5 cent different from what they normally charge. And so, and the same thing happened under NNC when they did this performance of consultation, right? And I think that piece is, how do you ensure that the questions aren't already generated by outside people who don't live in those contexts? How do you ensure people are then responsive to what actually gets shared with you? These are really, really important questions, and I don't know the answer to them. I'm sorry, I feel bad, but I don't know the answer.
I have an example that I wanted to introduce, which I don't think it's anecdotal. Like, I have the picture evidence. This, if you can see, is a picture of chicken breast. This is taken in Sioux Lookout in September of 2023. It is Granny's brand split chicken breast. It is $7.97. September 2023, $7.97. Here's the same Granny split back chicken breast landed in Sandy Lake in the same month of September 2023. It's $54. $7 to $54. This was shared on social media, which has played a huge role, I think, in bringing this conversation to the table. As someone who might benefit from publishing a book on the subject, it should be said that the Feeding My Family Facebook page and many Northern community members who post these things are the people who deserve the lion's share of the credit for raising awareness about this issue. If we wanted to ask the Northern store, how come it's $7.97 in Sioux Lookout and $54 in Sandy Lake? How much of that is going over to simple profits from the stores? And what's the cut of that is given over to transportation? Under the current agreements of the transfer payments between the federal government and the Northern store under those subsidy programs, the Northwest Company does not have to provide that information. Under the older programs, and we spoke with individuals who ran those programs, known as the Food Mail program prior to 2014, there were checks and balances on how much of that could be profit-centered. Because this reformation of the Food Mail program happened under Harper, it followed this very neoliberal market ideology where checks and balances were red tape, wasteful, liberal, bureaucratic nonsense, and we need to streamline and make everything efficient. Trudeau's been in power since 2015, am I right? That's all, we're getting close to 10 years of Trudeau. For a couple years, we could have said that the federal government, under the Liberals, was locked into this negative set of relations where they couldn't make the Northern store tell them how much profit they were stealing from these communities. It's 2023. Although I think we should respect specialization in policy, in shipping lanes, I do think that there is a way in which the federal government, for a very long time, has abandoned Northern northern communities to these neoliberal market ideologies set up under Harper. And time has come to make sure that these profit margins of the Northwest Company, even if this is a heavy-handed move top down from the state, to me, if asked for one thing about accountability that could be done actionably by the federal government, that would be it. We need to know why is it $54 in Sandy Lake and 7 in Sioux Lookout? You miss me with this claim that this is all in transportation. We work with many northern community members who know how much it costs to get a bag of potatoes from Sioux Lookout to Sandy Lake, right? That knowledge is in those communities, but it's currently not being actionally taken up in any sense at all. It's being abandoned so the Northwest Company can generate hundreds of millions in profits every year in some of the most poor and poorly served communities in the country.
Well, I think the thing that's most emblematic of this, right, would be, and particularly given Trudeau's, promise that he's going to make clean water available to Indigenous communities, is the fact that since its inception, the Northwest Company in 1987 has sold First Nations people their water back to them, right? That they themselves produced filters in communities, particularly in those communities that have boil water advisories, and then they sell that water back to them. And Lana, you and I know that this is a big question being asked by the communities that we work with. Like, how does this happen, right? How is this? And that was one thing I did not find in my research, is how did they get the right to sell people's water back to them?
Yeah, and I think throughout the book, right, the predatory behavior, in the best light, opportunistic, but more so predatory behavior is apparent. And for me, there was two pieces in particular that stuck with me, and I just kept thinking about throughout the rest of the day after I'd put down your book. And that was one of the ones. So on page 120 in chapter 6, there was a piece talking about how officials or members of the Northwest Company were talking about they had more profits and were able to benefit from Indian residential school settlement payments. That was one. The other piece was the selling back of the water. And so for me, those pieces were so egregious. And it left me with questions. In the book, I saw there's examples of some practices, like, for example, Sandy Lake being able to renegotiate their lease. We've talked about some potential mechanisms to enhance accountability. So moving forward, and I know this is a conversation for community and ultimately community's decision, but do you have any thoughts on what that structure looks like? So is there a role? Is there a role for the Northern Store moving forward? If so, what might that role look like? And how do we move forward some of the really inspiring and there's a term that I heard is, I think it's called kimooch. It's like just being really industrial and resourceful, right? And you've talked about it. And I know just from our conversations on a side, particularly Indigenous women are, kind of pounding the pavement, doing the work to ensure that there's food in their communities. So how do we support that work? So yeah, kind of thinking about both. Is there what can we carry with us? What does the future, or what could the future of Indigenous food security look like?
Well, I'll be very honest with you. Sorry, I'm getting a bit of feedback. The kind of incredible knowledge that I found that Indigenous women had in terms of just understand, like, one of my friends worked for her community, and they, for 6 weeks of every year during freeze up and thaw out, they don't have access to kind of, grocery stores. And so she was the person who helped community members order food for those 6 weeks to ensure that they had enough food. And I remember sitting just with her. I think I was talking on the phone to her, and she was looking at the list that people were making. She's like, oh, this family just kind of making notes. And she's like, this family didn't order enough food. And so we're going to have to go over that. And I'm just like, that is a skill to know, because I'm so used to I need another thing of milk. I'm going to go to the store right now. I could not fathom what I would need in terms of resources in order to ensure that my family was fed for 6 weeks without the opportunity to go to a store. And those are kinds of knowledges I think that we need to promote and share. And I mean, the other things are building capacity and ensuring knowledge transfer, I think, between communities. What we've learned from working, say, with Matawa and KCAT is that there are some communities that have these incredibly rich land-based intergenerational sharing and knowledge going on in terms of hunting and producing food and sharing food, and other communities don't, right? And so how do those communities learn to support each other without having the government or stores intervene in that? Does that make sense? Because I think one of the things that I find deeply troubling about the NNC is that it really negates the possibility of people sharing food between communities, so land-based foods between communities. Because in order for them to say, if you kill a moose and you want to ship some moose meat from one community to the next, it actually has, and you want it to count under the NNC subsidy and to have support for that, it has to be shipped to a federally registered abattoir. And there's none in the provincial north. There's only one in the Northwest Territories. And so it's got to go way far north and then come back and then be shipped to the community, right? And so I think one of the things that would be really helpful is these sorts of barriers that are just, they don't make sense, right? And part of that is maybe strengthening the capacity of communities to share and work with each other, rather than having to be forced to work with outside external agencies or settler organizations. They need to work with each other, and I think that's a better way to do it.
I think that's such an important, astute point too, of often, right, there's always this Indigenous settler logic, and organizing Indigenous peoples and First Nations to work in relation to settler people, corporations, governments, and it kind of negates, right, our ongoing diplomacy, governance, relationships that occurred before invasion. And often there's not enough time and attention and resources and critical conversation about thinking about what are those alternative futurities that recenter those governance and those kinship structures and networks. Travis, is there anything else that you want to add to what Kristin said in terms of thinking about what would be necessary for a better future for food security in the North, and who has a role to play in that?
Well, one of the first things that comes up when I want to add on to this is in 2016, following a crisis in their community, the Ottawa-Piscat Youth Council called for a privatization of the Northern Store. And this, to me, is a matter of principle, right? Like, I support the Ottawa-Piscat Youth Council. Whatever my opinions might be of the Northwest Company, negative or positive, spoiler alert, they're pretty negative, but I really support and affirm what communities are saying themselves, especially youth councils, right? Chief Donnie Morris of KI First Nation has also called for reparations to be paid, which I think is a conversation that is always a difficult one. But I watched a great documentary recently called Bridges to the North that a friend and colleague of mine, Tony McGuire of They Media, created. And this is really looking at the complicated politics of what does sovereignty look like in the current moment of economic development. And I think at the current moment, especially in Northwestern Ontario, there is so much expert in community, not only in food systems and shipments, but the amount of legal fees and memorandums of understanding and impact benefit agreements. There's expert technical knowledges, brilliant people in those communities. In addition to the calls for reparations and privatization, I also think that clearly and predictably, there will be an overhaul of these food subsidy programs that were edited under Harper. And when that process happens, I would hope to see not just consultation, but a meaningful, free, prior, and informed consent being sought from these communities, actionably trying to get at that expert knowledge and really, in a way, try and prop up not only Indigenous food sovereignty, but as well as Indigenous entrepreneurship, because this is a hole in the bucket situation. This company has practiced this for several decades now. They are very good at taking this money right out of the community. And this is something that I think has many possible stopgaps that we'll see in the next decade for sure.
And I would just, in other words, I would just say, I think the settlers state and settlers kind of need to get out of the way, right? Like that's part of the problem, is that we keep trying to intervene and make the model look somewhat like, you know, Western European ideas of capitalism, right? Like that's still the kind of worldview we continue to operate from, and then we need to just get out of the way.
And I have so much more that I could talk to you about and questions and things to pick up on, but I want to be mindful of time and have some time for folks in the audience to join the conversation and if they have any questions. So at this point, I'll turn it back over to the publisher to facilitate a Q&A. A brief, but still time for a Q&A.
Hello. Yeah, we have a Q&A. If anyone has any questions, like please feel free to drop them. I believe it should be at the bottom of your screen. Yeah.
Is it possible to see people's faces or who's here? Is that?
Unfortunately not in a webinar. Yeah, sorry about that.
Sorry, I just exposed my age and my inability to understand technology there.
No, not at all.
And maybe while we're waiting, I know I've, kind of driven some of the conversation points. Is there anything that we haven't talked about, or maybe that isn't in the book too, that you wanted to bring up during this launch? So if there's anything, maybe we could speak a bit about that while folks have time to generate their thoughts and questions.
I just wanted to make one sort of observation comment to really kind of hammer home the kind of different context in which market operations take place in some First Nations and Northern communities. So during COVID, right, in Southern communities, there was a lot of people who worked in grocery stores, retailers, they got extra money, they got more hours, and there were benefits, right? Still treated very poorly within a very problematic system, but there were benefits to working more hours and they got slightly higher pay. In one of the communities that I work with, their employees at the Northern store were volunteering in order to ensure that community members got the food that they ordered in a timely manner. If that had taken place in the southern part of Canada, those people would have been paid overtime. They wouldn't have been expected to volunteer extra hours to make sure their family members and their relatives were fed, right? And so I think we need to understand the very different context in which a lot of this takes place, right? Sorry, Joseph, did you have a question? Hey, Joe.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, it's nice to have you here. Thank you.
Well, this is brilliant. I just wanted to commend the work and certainly appreciate the passion and the sort of longitudinal work that's happened here. It's sort of like it's really, really brilliant. So you hit so many nails on the head. I was like, really blown away. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to like pharmacy or medical relations, that you had sort of mentioned it in your opening, and I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Thank you for asking that question, Joe. I super appreciate it because I wanted to show this continuity. So if you look at the Hudson's Bay Company, they're providing healthcare. They're expected to have, they actually provide medical kits and booklets for like post managers to be able to provide Indigenous folks with some kind of healthcare, right? But on the Northwest Company's website, they actually have one of their kind of subsidiaries is called AM Docs. And I'm just going to read you a portion of their advertising. AM Docs provides community-based physician services to remote, underserved communities in northern Manitoba and Ontario. AM Docs physicians live and work in First Nations communities. As such, they take on leadership roles in these communities, health systems, training other providers, and counseling patients and their families regarding healthier living. So that is something that's run by the Northern Store. So not only do they provide pharmacy services, not only do they provide credit cards and banking services and check cashing services, they are now ensuring that there are locums in First Nations communities that often don't have physicians. Can you imagine this sort of all kind of encompassing control and influence and power that gives one corporation in a community of 500 people? It's shocking and scary. And Joe, you're to blame for taking me down this rabbit hole. I want you to know that.
I'll just add quickly here a quick quote from the 2006 annual report of the Northwest Company. They noted that, quote, in the North, the demands for pharmacy and other healthcare products is growing at a rapid pace, triggered by a younger than average but still aging population and by the high incidence of related disease, most notably type 2 diabetes. Our plans over the next 5 years are aimed at earning a distinct, trusted identity for Northwest as a local healthcare provider. And what I'm getting at here is trying to connect this to the quote where they're monitoring these communities in many ways. Sometimes this is financial surveillance through things like the law and settlements to the IRS system. And sometimes this is them looking at high rates of type 2 diabetes in community, which the Northwest Company probably has a hand in creating, given that they make so much money with all those fast food outlets and quick stops, that they're also always trying to find ways to turn a profit in the North in ways that I expect corporations to act in avaricious ways, but the level of Scrooge McDuckery and of like Dickensian surveillance and evil that this company has, and I know I'm speaking a little forcefully here, but candidly, the ways in which they surveil these communities to pull every possible penny out, especially with the issue of type 2 diabetes, is one that I find particularly egregious, and their development of those pharmaceutical services should be looked at as a continuation of the segregation of healthcare in Canada. And I would even connect this, and this might be a little heavy-handed, not everyone in the call might sign off on this, but this is a play out also of the larger Indian hospital system and the separation of healthcare between the Indigenous North and the Canadian South that is continuing to play out in ways that the Northwest Company is able to profit from. Joe, you're also someone who, has done lots of work in this area and has lots of knowledge. Are there comments that you have as well as questions to feedback to any of this?
Well, I think you've, how do I say this, sort of like removed the veil of the like martyr role bullshit that they pull in a lot of spaces, right? So like I'm a member of Canada's Food Policy Advisory Council, and really a lot of that rhetoric that you touched on, Travis, is very true. I've sat in NNC meetings and observed their meetings with Northwest Company, and it's that same sort of like martyr role, while at the same time selling a different story and telling a different story in the annual reports and other things. So that part I felt was really, really important, because we try to challenge people to understand the systems behind what's being presented in front of them. So, rates of type 2 diabetes, amputations in community, the elements that are there. You touched on water. These are intentional states to create that dependency. And I really appreciate how you brilliantly pull that narrative into, what is actually, I hope usable. You mentioned sort of actioning history, and, some of where we're at is we need these type of interventions. Kristin, you mentioned getting out of the way, that sort of shift in colonial narrative to then recognize that there's not just historical harm, but ongoing harm related to these. And, you know, the reason I asked about healthcare and pharmacy is this is the trend that is disturbingly continuing to progress. So now, you know, those who had a hand in creating the states of food insecurity and poor health outcomes are now going to again position themselves as the martyrs to provide the health care. And I think that's a really important thing that you've, like I said, sort of removed the veil from. And yeah, I'm excited to, you know, share these works and continue that narrative, because I think you've helped immensely in that. You know, if we can sort of direct people to read this book and then have a conversation about policy, I think we'd have a better starting point than continually trying to really like say that this is what happened and it was intentional and it's still happening. So that's my feedback.
I think that what's important is that kind of red washing piece that Lana alluded to earlier, right? That they use their kind of charity as a distraction, and then they complain that they don't make enough money because they know costs are too high. This region is, you know, they call it, you know, remote and rural, and, you know, the sun never sets, and like there's all these kind of descriptions of hardness, right? But then enormous amounts of profits are being made, and the two cannot be. Corporations are there to make money. They wouldn't be there if they were making money. And I think they're very good at distracting us from that, right?
I just wanted to invite any more questions in the chat. You could also raise your hand just at the bottom of your screen there, and I can allow you to talk. Sometimes it's a bit easier than typing. Yeah.
And for those people that don't want to have a conversation here, I appreciate that. And I'm happy if people want to contact me. Is my email address, is it possible to put it in the chat and people can, yeah, if people want to contact me off, I mean, because sometimes it's, you know, it's a little intimidating to talk in front of people. And so if people want to contact me off email, I'm happy to do that as well.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, great. Thank you, Travis. So both of their emails are in the chat now. Unless there's any more questions, I just wanted to thank everyone so much for coming tonight, and thanks again to our authors and Lana for hosting. This has been, I think, such an interesting night. And I just wanted to remind everyone the promo code for the book is North 30, so you can get that on our website. And if there are no more questions, I hope everyone has a really great rest of your night.